The Trump administration is reportedly preparing to have the federal government take a 10% stake in Intel, making Uncle Sam into the company's largest shareholder, which might be one more signal of a growing comfort in the Republican Party with a kind of corporate statism.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We were joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. What a tumultuous few weeks for Intel CEO Lip-Bu. First, President Trump calling for his immediate resignation, arguing that he is conflicted due to ties with companies in China. Then a meeting at the White House, apparently smoothing things over. Here is a piece of the president's Truth Social post coming out of that. Quote, I met with Mr. Lip-Bu of Intel. The meeting was a very interesting one. His success and rise is an amazing story. Mr. Tan and my cabinet members are going to spend time together and bring suggestions to me during the next week, unquote. Alicia, one of these suggestions now apparently arising, including at this Oval Office meeting, at this White House meeting reportedly, is the idea that the government might take a ownership stake in Intel, maybe one as big as 10%, which, according to some sources, would make the U.S. government and taxpayers the largest single shareholder in Intel. Here is a report of a Wall Street Journal news story. It says one option under consideration is converting some of the money that Intel was slated to receive from the 2022 Chips and Science Act into an equity stake, unquote. Let's listen to Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, discussing this idea on CNBC this morning.
We want Intel to be successful in America, okay? We'd like an American transistor built in America, right? We'd like an American to be doing that. So Donald Trump says, hey, look, let's turn the money that Biden was going to just give away and turn that to equity for the American people. Yes, it is a worse deal than giving it away. But when you put this money in the hands of Donald Trump, you're going to get a better deal for the American taxpayer. That's who Donald Trump is, and it's obviously the right move to make.
Alicia, what do you make of this? The statement there from the Commerce Secretary, a better deal for the U.S. taxpayer.
Well, I think that it's a questionable and dubious statement, not least because it's not even clear that the administration has authority under the CHIPS Act to do this. The money was provided for, was supposed to be for grants and loans or loan guarantees. And what the administration is proposing is somewhat unprecedented. It did propose to use Defense Production Act to make an equity investment in a critical minerals or mining company to ensure that the U.S. has adequate supply. But that's again a commodity in which we are dependent on China, and we're trying to build a supply chain. So we aren't as dependent on China. Here, if you listen to the Commerce Secretary, he's kind of muddying the waters here by saying that we need an American company to build these chips in America. Now, there's TSMC, Samsung, Global Foundries have received CHIPS Act money for plants for foundries that have been and already are producing chips in America for expansion projects. Global Foundries, by the way, is an American company. The other two, TSMC is a Taiwanese company, and Samsung is South Korean. But they already are producing chips in the U.S. that are actually at a much better quality than Intel's. Now, Intel's problems go back many, many years. You could say probably at least 20, when they just kind of strategically made some decisions. They didn't invest in or decide to design chips for the Apple iPhone when they were provided an opportunity by Steve Jobs. So they didn't foresee the booming market for that. And then more recently, under the former CEO, Pat Gelsinger, they made a pretty big and costly bet on expanding their manufacturing and foundries in the U.S. And to some extent abroad too, with the idea or hope of going toe-to-toe with Samsung and TSMC. Now, this is a very capital-intensive business, of which they didn't have much experience in. and they've really struggled to compete there. And as a result, they're racking up huge losses. $18.8 billion last year, and another, I think, $3.8 billion in the first 6 quarters, or 6 months of this year. And so this is just the context for why the administration is now looking to make an equity investment in Intel. Is it's financially struggling. It's been laying off tens of thousands of workers, 15,000 last year, and it's set to lay off another 24,000 this year. And this is essentially trying to prevent Intel, which the Biden administration, now Trump administration, have made out to be this national champion, to prevent it from failing.
Kim, one lesson here, it strikes me, is the dangers of accepting government subsidies, government money, maybe even the dangers of pushing for those funds. And I think there were already lessons that could be learned given the way that the Biden administration treated this CHIPS Act money. Remember, the bill passed, and then the Biden administration went back and said, actually, we want to put some extra strings on this money. We want to make sure that your workforces have high quality childcare options available to them and whatnot. And now we have a change in administrations and totally new people running these departments, Howard Lutnick running the Commerce Department, and they have a different perspective on what they want in exchange for that money.
You have to love Howard Lutnick. He says, we really want an American company to be successful in this area, and then proposes the one thing that would guarantee that the situation actually become worse, which is that government be involved. Literally, is there anything government has ever done, will ever do, that could ever compete with the entrepreneurialism of the United States and our private sector? No. I mean, government's a basket case. We have Doge in there right now, simply trying to get the Social Security Administration to not hand money hand over fist to fictional people and update technology that hasn't been touched in 50 years, but somehow the government is going to tell Intel how to run its business better. I mean, that the idea is laughable, and the fault here is on both sides. I think both sides deserve a lot of criticism. Yes, like, who didn't see that coming when Intel took money with the Biden administration in charge, that the next thing up would be all these rules explaining how they had to manage their childcare programs internally and various other things. The business community has lost a lot of its independence and free market fierceness, especially big players. You still have a lot of that in small business in America, competition, et cetera. But corporate America has become very comfortable with subsidies and feeding at the federal trough, instead of focusing on innovation, hiring a fleet of lobbyists to get on the federal gravy train. And these are the kind of consequences, because, by the way, we know exactly what will happen if a stake like this comes. I mean, you subsidize companies, then you essentially nationalize them, and then you make sure they never fail, and then you have Soviet model. It's just a really, really bad idea. But the government has also made mistakes here. We have too many in Congress who hilariously do actually think that government would do a better job of micromanaging a company. And of course, they have every interest in doing that from a sort of partisan personal level, depending on your ambitions, whether it's because you want to impose certain restrictions on companies or demand that they expand their offerings to their workers, whatever. But instead of the government's longtime view, which did prevail over many decades, was that the business community was this remarkable asset that America had, and that you would turn to it for its expertise when the government really needed that assist. And we've seen it, over the last 100 years in the space area, in manufacture. I mean, think about the contributions the free sector made during World War II to our production and capacity in armaments and munitions. It was remarkable. Encryption. Now, because politicians are politicians, they see more of an interest in having these ownership stakes and directing things through industrial policy. And it's not going to end up in a good outcome for anybody.
One risk is throwing good taxpayer money after bad. Alicia, you use the phrase too big to fail. And if that's the outcome here, I mean, which administration is going to be the one that is eager to shut off the subsidy tap if the result of that would be a real business loss for Intel and maybe more layoffs, more jobs lost, less production in the United States? Alicia, this also comes on the heels of another Trump administration intervention in these chip markets. The Commerce Department recently lifted a export restriction on selling certain AI chips to China, but as part of that, the government is also now saying that it wants a 15% cut on the sales of those chip exports to China. I mean, similar questions, Alicia? Does the Trump administration have the legal authority to do that? And what do you make of this as another intervention in the market?
Right. So this is the Trump administration imposed these export controls on these the chip known as the H20 chip, and AMD Advanced Micro Devices has a similar AI chip. Now these aren't the most advanced chips that they make. Those have already been subject to export controls under the Biden administration, but the Trump administration extended these export controls in the spring under at least the pretext of national security, that they were important to prevent China from getting around their export controls and using these chips to advance its AI capabilities, which it could use to also advance its military capabilities. Now, this was the explanation that they provided at the time. Fast forward a couple of months, and they were trying to negotiate a trade truce with China. And at the time, when they announced that in June, they said, well, we're not going to lift any kind of export controls on chips. Chips this is non-negotiable because it's national security. Well, a month later, it turned out to be very negotiable. And they did ease the chip controls after lobbying from NVIDIA. Um, and NVIDIA made some, reasonable arguments that, well, if we don't sell to China, China is just going to rely on Huawei chips. And Huawei is going to gain more ground in China and could potentially set the global standards. Now, that's a reasonable argument. The problem here is that the administration didn't use that when it said that it was going to ease the export controls. They said, well, we're going to now take a 15% cut, suggesting that there's some kind of transactional that, well, as long as the U.S. chip makers pay the government, then they can sell chips to China. And this is seems a little bit like state extortion of the kind that China actually in Beijing practice. So this is another version, as you point out, of state capitalism and state getting more involved in private industry. In this case, extracting a cut or essentially some kind of commission for doing business.
To be clear, if there's a national security argument for not exporting certain AI chips to China, an adversary, that would be one thing. Kim, what makes this confusing to me is I don't know what the argument is for allowing the exports of the chips to happen, but with a 15% tax to the US government. And where does that money go? A couple other data points we can add here. One is this talk by the Trump administration of creating a sovereign wealth fund. Maybe they would take some of this money and put it in a sovereign wealth fund where the White House, the administration, can use that money to make investments. There's been some talk about maybe the sovereign wealth fund would take a stake in TikTok or maybe buy TikTok. So the U.S. government would have ownership or partial ownership of a social media site. Another is this golden share deal that the Trump administration got as part of the approval of the Japanese Nippon Steel acquisition of U.S. Steel. When that deal finally went through in June, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was explaining some of the terms of it. It says this golden share requires U.S. government approval or consultation for such things as protections regarding employee salaries, anti-dumping, pricing, raw materials, and sourcing outside the U.S., acquisitions, closure or idling of plants before certain timeframes other than normal course temporary idling for safety upgrades, etc. It sounds pretty well involved in the actual running of the U.S. Steel's day-to-day business. Kim, what do you make of this? I mean, several data points here of the Trump administration being pretty comfortable with intervening in the private economy. I mean, maybe part of it is just that President Trump himself, of course, a longtime businessman and maybe more comfortable than other occupants of the Oval Office, getting CEOs on the phone and arguing and negotiating with them and thinking that he's comfortable calling some of the shots.
Yeah, I think it actually goes farther than that. I mean, first of all, on the export tax, what exposes this as just a straight up government shakedown is the government's incredibly obvious actions and statements here. What do you really care about? The Commerce Department imposed this export controls in the name of national security. And okay, we can have a discussion about that. Is it really wise to be shipping all of our advanced stuff to China? Alicia said these weren't the most advanced chips, but what's the level at which you do begin to care about allowing a clear adversary to have access to some of this tech? That's a legitimate discussion to be had. Commerce Department claimed it made a judgment and that these particular products were too important to allow out of the country. Okay, but then NVIDIA lobbies and the White House makes this deal and relaxes the export tax and the export restrictions in return for China easing some restrictions on its own exports. So which is it? Is it a national security risk, or are you just deal making in pursuit of a new cash cow? It seems very obvious it's a second. And I take on board your point, Kyle, about Donald Trump and his businessman's background. But when you begin to put all of these data points together, I think it goes beyond Trump just simply being comfortable getting on the phone with CEOs. Unfortunately, I think a feature of this second term is that Donald Trump is treating the federal government like a personal business venture. This is the new company I own, and this is what you do when you own a company. You buy stakes, you engage in mergers, you try to extort these deals out of your competitors, etc. There's an element of that is useful in terms of him and dealing with other countries and sort of negotiations and his particular business style that he uses sometimes in bluffing and getting things to go his way in terms of his interactions with other countries. But when you begin to sort of treat the federal government as an acquisition fund in which you're sort of going out there to buy stakes in this or that, it sounds very good to say, let's run the government like a business. And I think the way most people think about that is, let's insert into government some of those principles that business has to operate by. For instance, hitting targets, becoming more efficient, actually producing something that anybody wants. But when you're instead looking at it as just one great giant fund where your obligation is to be raising money for the federal government by applying taxes or taking shares or using new tariffs to try to generate revenue for the government. Like, I think that's taking the business concept a bit far, because that is not fundamentally what government exists to do.
One more tile in our mosaic here, Alicia, is the president's pressure on pharmaceutical companies to lower prices on prescription drugs. He wrote a recent letter to big drug makers. This is part of what he said. If you refuse to step up, we will deploy every tool in our arsenal to protect American families from continued abusive drug pricing practices, unquote. And Alicia, you know more about the details of that than I do, but it's true that there are countries that pay low drug prices because they have price controls. They have highly government-run healthcare systems. And one approach that a president, a White House could take is to be on the side of American pharmaceutical companies and patients who want new cures, who want advances, against those foreign systems that are underpaying for drugs. And another way is to be on the side of those systems and against American pharmaceutical makers.
Right. So this is a somewhat complicated issue. I think it's a little overstated how much less the Europeans, Canadians, other countries with socialized health systems pay than the U.S. for drugs. About 90% of drugs are actually generics in the U.S. Or prescriptions, and those are about a third less expensive than they are in other countries. And about half of revenue from the brand drug sales and Keytruda, Humira, these blockbusters actually go to some kind of intermediaries, and that, by the way, includes the government, because the government requires the drug companies to essentially pay kickbacks to Medicaid programs in return for selling their drugs. So the prices are actually prices in the U.S. The list prices aren't actually as high as a lot of the critics claim, because of all these discounts that go to the hospitals, pharmacy benefit managers, and Medicaid programs. Now, putting all that aside, if you consider this a big problem, or as Mr. Trump does, then the solution would seem to be to negotiate with these other countries that don't pay would might be considered the fair price. Europe in trade negotiations, and Canada included. But the U.S. Trump just hailed this new trade agreement with Europe, and it doesn't affect or touch anything regarding pharmaceutical prices or controls. So the result being that, well, the Trump administration afterwards put out this threat that it had hinted at earlier in the year, that we may use all these tools in our arsenal, and that would include potentially revoking approvals for drugs. They've also floated ironically, export controls on drugs that are made in the U.S., and that's just seems to be a disincentive to manufacture in the U.S. FDA Commissioner Marty McCary suggested that, or floated that, well, maybe the agency will give fast track or faster reviews to companies that provide lower prices in the U.S. And this insinuation there is that, well, maybe we'll slow roll drug approvals if companies don't reduce their prices. So a lot of this is, again, thinly veiled extortion against drug makers. The Trump proposed in the end of his first term a most favored nation that would set U.S. drug prices on par with other countries with these socialized systems. It was struck down by the courts because he did not have the authority to do that. So now he's essentially trying to do the same by essentially threatening companies.
Kim, we'll give you the last word, but do you suppose this new shift for a Republican president is a market turn for the GOP, or maybe something more fleeting? Is there any hope left for free marketeers? I mean, I remember back in the Tea Party wave, it was very common to hear from Republican politicians who would say things like, the Obama administration is always talking about how many jobs it created, and I know, that only the private sector creates jobs. All government can do is get out of the way. That was the kind of rhetoric of that age, and it turned pretty quickly now into the MAGA movement. One thing that might also be a factor in this is, I guess, how these investments and market interventions actually go. If there's a sovereign wealth fund created by President Trump and it starts doling out money here and there, it will matter if some of the names of those companies it is investing in start to ring a little bit like Solyndra used to.
Yeah, if you look out in the Republican Party right now, I would still say that probably 75 to 80%, especially at least of elected members of Congress and kind of what you would call true movement conservatives, still are very much in the camp of free markets and free people, the way the Wall Street Journal editorial page is. But you have had this growth of the MAGA movement, and there's a long history there. I mean, that goes back to Trump. I think Trump himself has generally a lot of free market instincts, but what you've seen happen is, as ambitious politicians have doubled down on his quote unquote populism. And that's not always a perfect word for it, but some of his taking some of his views, for instance, on trade and immigration that were a little more unorthodox in the party at the time and expanding them in new ways, like industrial policy. It's become a sort of self-reinforcing mechanism. He hears a lot more from those people. He doubles down, they double down, he doubles down, and you get more in this position. How does that end? Not entirely sure. But, again, just to round this back to Lutnick, they are very good at making the sort of talking points case. He's like, look, this is just so much better for the American taxpayer. If we're going to be giving all this money to Intel, like we should at least get our share of it, et cetera. That sounds good, except for when you look at what the obvious alternative and better alternative to that is I agree with Howard Lutnick. We shouldn't be giving billions of dollars to Intel and getting nothing back. And the answer is to not give billions of dollars to Intel at all and let that company sink or swim on its own. And I always say this to people. Everyone's like, well, what's the answer to corporate lobbyists and how do we end all of this? Government's just a swamp. Totally agreed. And if you want to get rid of lobbyists, get rid of government interference in the business sector, because then they have nothing to lobby for anymore. And that's a lot more efficient, straightforward way to approach the business community in government, which is just to get the heck out of the way and then partnership with it at times when its intellectual achievements and various other attributes can help in some government project here or there.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.